for that introduction, and thank you also for Dafan for responding. I only gave him the notes for this lecture last night, so I should give him very special thanks for doing something that's at the very last minute. I've been working on Truthmaker Semantics for quite some time now, over 10 years. And there's been a growing interest in the subject, more and more papers, a number of conferences. And the book that Yong Cheng mentioned, which is a very long, big book actually, over almost 800 pages, at least half of the contributions, this is in the Springer volume, at least half of those contributions concern Truthmaker semantics. I was a bit of a loss to know what to cover in today's lecture. So I thought what I would do is, first of all, just give a brief overview of some of the basic elements of Truthmaker semantics, which might be especially helpful for those people that don't know anything about it. And then I thought that rather than talk about some of the applications, though I'm happy to do that in the discussion, I would talk about the problems that are involved in extending Truthmaker semantics from the propositional to the quantificational case. I've been writing a textbook with Mark Jago on this question, and it occurred to us while writing the textbook that there are a number of issues about how to extend the semantics to the quantifiers. So this is what I want to talk about. So this is actually something that I'm currently thinking about. So it's really, as far as I'm aware, it's not a topic that's really properly been discussed in the literature at all. As for the most part, people have just been interested in the propositional case. Okay, so and just by explaining to you some of the very basic elements of Truthmaker semantics. There are many different approaches to semantics, or the study of meaning. One is the truth conditional approach, and this is the idea that we give we specify the meaning of a sentence in terms of its truth conditions. That is, the conditions under which it's true. Now, this is just a slogan, and how to unpack it is far from clear. Okay. One way of unpacking it is not to take truth conditions seriously as objects in their own right. So those of you that know about Davidson's work can think of his semantics, which conditions for sentences to be true, as one that doesn't involve rareifying truth conditions. But another approach does rarefy truth conditions. It says there are these things which are the truth conditions. And if you adopt that approach, then you face two fundamental problems. One is, what are these entities that are truth conditions? And the other is, what is it for one of these entities to be a truth condition? So these are two fundamental problems. Now, what is perhaps the predominant form of semantics today answers that, is the possible world semantics. And that gives a quite clear answer to both of those questions. The things, entities that make a sentence true, are possible worlds, okay, which can be specified through a complete description of how things are. Or insofar as you're only concerned with a language of limited expressive power, it's a possible world will involve everything that's relevant to the truth of the sentences of your language. But the important thing here are, first of all, that the worlds are possible. So a world is something that can possibly obtain. We don't have impossible worlds. And the second thing is that they are worlds. That is, that they're in a certain sense complete. Okay. So insofar as the truth or falsity of a sentence can be resolved, the world will resolve that question. Okay. And then the idea of, so that's what the entities are, the truth conditions. They are possible worlds. And what is it for a possible world to make a sentence true? Well, this is really understood in modal terms. That is, it's impossible for the possible world to obtain and for the sentence not to be true. So it's just a straightforward modal connection. Okay. So let me just give you one consequence of that understanding of what it is for a truth condition to be a truth condition of a sentence. If you've got some sentence that's necessarily true, such as P or not P, then every possible world will make it true. Because since it's impossible for the sentence not to be true, it's going to be impossible for the possible world to obtain the sentence not to be true. Okay. So the important thing I want to emphasize here is this understanding of the connection between the true conditions and the sentences which they are truth conditions is one that doesn't necessarily involve any relevant connection. It's a modal connection. That tie, semantic tie, is understood in modal terms. Now, under Truthmaker Semantics, we have both a different understanding of what the truth conditions are, what these entities are, and a different understanding of the connection. So, first of all, I'm going to call them truth makers now rather than truth conditions. The truth makers don't have to be complete. They don't have to be worlds. If you like, they can be bits of worlds. So my sitting here giving the lecture is by no means a whole world, but under Truthmaker Semantics, it can be regarded as a truth maker. So truth makers don't have to be complete. If you're good in the truth maker, they don't have to settle the truth value of every sentence under consideration, insofar as the truth value can be settled. Okay. So we give up the requirement of completeness, or the fact that these entities have to be worlds. We also give up the requirement that these entities have to be possible, entities that can possibly obtain or exist or whatever. So my sitting, there's a state of affairs of my sitting, there's also a state of affairs of my standing. And if you like, there's the fusion or conjunction of those two states of affairs, the state of affairs of my sitting and of my standing. And that's an impossible state of affairs. I can't both be sitting and standing, but we will allow such a state of affairs to be a truth maker. Okay. So this is double departure from possible world semantics. We give up the idea that these entities need to be possible, and we give up the idea that they need to be worlds. Okay. Now, Truthmaker Semantics isn't by any means the only truth conditional semantics on the market that has this broader conception of truth conditionals, truth makers. If you go back, for example, to situation semantics, which was very popular in the late 60s, early 70s, and is still actually used in the formal semantics of natural language, you'll find there an advocacy of partial states. Or again, those of you who know about the semantics for relevance logic will appreciate that there we countenance impossible states. Okay. So this particular aspect of Truthmaker Semantics is not at all distinctive. Okay. But what is distinctive is the understanding of the connection between a truth maker and the sentence it makes true. And this is because the usual understanding of this relation is one in which the truth makers, and I'll use a sort of slightly technical term, truth makers don't have to be exact. That is, that they can contain more than is relevant to the truth of the sentence that they make true. So this is a characteristic of the possible world semantics. The sentence that I'm giving a talk right now is made true in many different possible worlds. There's the present, the actual world, of course. There's one in which there are fewer people attending, and there's one in which I'm in a different room, and so on and so forth. So there are many different possible worlds, but all of them have the feature that they contain a lot more than is relevant. Well, maybe there's a world in which or only thing that happens is I'm speaking. I don't know, but anyway, nearly all of them will be such that they contain a lot more than is relevant to the truth of the sentence. The fact that it actually is cold outside right now. So in the actual world, in Berlin, there's snow on the ground and so on and so forth. That's an aspect of the world. It's completely irrelevant to the truth of the sentence that I'm giving a talk. Okay. So that's a feature of the possible world semantics. And that's also a feature of these alternative semantics, which have this broader conception of what the truth makers are, that allow possible or impossible or partial truth makers. Okay. So a formal way of indicating this aspect is that these semantics are what you might call monotonic. So if you take, there's a natural idea of one state containing another. So the state of it being cold outside and my giving a talk contains the state of my giving a talk. There's a natural relation of containment among states. And all of these semantics, perhaps just one or two minor exceptions, are monotonic. That is, that if a state makes a sentence true, then any state containing that state will make the sentence true. Okay. Okay. What's distinctive, or perhaps the most distinctive thing about truthmaker semantics in comparison with other forms of semantics is that we insist that truthmakers should be exact. That is, the truthmaker should be relevant as a whole, and not just in part, to the sentence it makes true. So there is this relevance requirement built in. It's not simply that the truth maker should be relevant, but to the truth of the sentence that it makes true, but it should be exactly relevant. It should be relevant as a whole. We should be able to see every bit of the truth maker playing its part, so to speak, in making the sentence true. If we can't see some part of the truth maker playing a role in making the sentence true, then we don't have an exact truth maker. Okay. And the real, the most distinctive feature of truthmaker semantics is that one, that truth makers should be exact. Okay. And that means that we have to give up the monotonicity requirement, that we have to give up the requirement that if something is a truth maker, then anything containing it is also a truth maker. Because, of course, the relevance condition may then be lost because you may just add something to the truth maker that has no bearing at all on the truth of the sentence. Okay. Now, this monotonicity condition is a very useful condition to have mathematically. It often makes life a lot simpler. I mean, I mean, here's an example, just one example from many. If you look at Kripke's semantics for intuitionistic logic, okay, it's built into that semantics that this condition is satisfied. So, in fact, that's essential for getting the right logic. So, let's call this notion forcing that he has. That you have a condition forcing a sentence to be true. And if a condition forces the sentence to be true, then any condition containing it will force the sentence to be true. And that plays an integral role, actually, in getting the semantics to work. So if you don't have that condition, things can often turn out to be a lot more difficult from a purely technical point of view, even though it's a very natural condition from a more philosophical point of view. But what I think is extraordinary, and this actually to some extent took me by surprise, is how insisting upon that one condition can have huge potential significance in terms of the application of the semantics. That is, once you insist upon this requirement of relevance, you could do many things in the semantics that you just couldn't do before. They just naturally fall out. So if you like, even though there's a technical cost, there's a huge philosophical gain, and a gain also in potential application. Okay. All right, so that is just a brief introduction to the underlying motivation behind Truthmaker Semantics. I don't know whether it's a little odd for me to talk and not be able to see many of the audience and not get any feedback. I don't know if it's appropriate for people to ask questions when I'm giving the talk, or maybe that's too unwieldy. I don't know. But if there's, maybe I'll stop at certain points, and if anyone has just a purely clarificatory question, I could answer it. I don't know if that's true.
Excuse me, Fan. Excuse me, Fan. Would you like to share your handout or slide? Maybe
well, I will later. I will. It's not relevant right now, but yeah, I will be doing that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I will do that. Okay. So what I want to do now is describe a truthmaker semantics for propositional logic. And by propositional logic, I just mean the logic, straightforward truth functional logic. So we have some sentence letters in the language. We can form complex sentences using the truth functional connectives or and not in the usual fashion. So that's a very simple language. Of course, later we'd want to extend that language in various ways, but this is the simplest case. And any semantics worth its salt is going to be able to have to deal with this case. Okay. Now, in any semantics, there's usually something which we might call the pre-semantical setup. So there's a setup in which you say nothing about the language, and then you have the language. I've told you what the language is, and then you connect the two. Okay, so you connect these two things, one more or less on the side of the world, so to speak, the other side of the language, and then you have the connection. So let me give you the pre-semantical connection. I'm going to share the screen because it's probably just easier to do it that way. Does that seem okay?
Yes, we can see the slide. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let me. So this is the relevant bit. I cannot actually. I can't. Okay. All right. So the pre-semantical setup involves something which it's called the state space. Okay. So I'm thinking of the states as the truth makers. Okay. Now, state is really a term of art here. You could have different views as to what these states are. They could just be events or states of affairs or laws. Some people even think they can be individuals. I don't, but anyway. It's a term of art. What you just take whatever your favorite truth maker might be. Okay. And we have a state space, which is an ordered pair. So it has two elements. One is the domain of states, which we take to be a non-empty set. Okay. So if you like, this is what corresponds to W in the possible world semantics. That is a non-empty set of worlds. And what we have is a mereology on those states. So we have a little bit of structure here. So I use this inclusion relation for part whole. So S and then this symbol T means S is a part of T. And we impose two conditions. One is that it should be a partial order. That is, it should be reflexive, transitive, anti-symmetric. So everything's a part of itself. If S is a part of T a part of U, then S is a part of U. And anti-symmetric, that if S is a part of U and U is a part of if S is part of T and T is part of S, then they're the same. Okay. And now we also have a completeness condition. So we say that any subset of S should have a least upper bound. So if I take any set of states, there should be a state that lies above all of those states. That is, all of those other states are part of it. And it should be the least such state, so that if it's any other state that contains all the other states, then it should contain, or be, that is, contain or be identical to the given state. So if you take some states and you look at all the states that lie above them, I'm thinking above as just, if a state is one state, if one state's a part of another, then it lies below the other. That's how I'm thinking. The parts are below. So if you've got some states, you look at all the states that lie above those states, and there's going to be one of them that lies below all of the others. Okay, that's the least upper bound. Okay, so this is what's called the complete semi-lattice. Okay, it's a familiar mathematical condition. Okay, it's perhaps worth pointing out that we allow the two extreme cases. So there's the case in which the subset is empty. So this empty set of states is going to have the least upper bound, and this is going to be the least state. This is going to be a state such that every other state lies above it. Okay, this we sometimes call this the null state. The null state. So nothing under standard interpretation, nothing is required for the null state to obtain. Okay. This one, if you like, that just automatically obtains because it has no real content. Also, if you take the set of all states, that will also have a least upper bound, and that will be the state that lies above all the other states. Okay, that contains it as parts. That's sometimes called the full state. Okay. So this structure will have this null state at the bottom and this full state at the top. Now, there's a slight variant on this last condition. And actually, initially, when I worked on Truthmaker Semantics, I insisted upon this condition. Then I realized that there's no need to insist upon the condition. And now I've come back and I thought, well, you actually will come to see there are some reasons to insist upon it. Okay. So anyway, there's a weakening of completeness. Completeness says that if you've got a subset of states, then it has a least upper bound. And bounded completeness says that if this subset has an upper bound, then it has a least upper bound. Okay. Now, those of you who know about Scott domain semantics will know that that's the kind of completeness you have there. Okay, so you don't necessarily insist that every set of states has an upper bound. So, for example, the set of all states may not have a least upper bound. Though you do want to insist that if it does have an upper bound, then it has a least upper bound. So it's a conditional form of completeness. One obvious reason to have bounded completeness is that you want your states to be possible. Okay. Now, if these states, if I get the state of my sitting and the state of my standing, and I take the least upper bound, which is intuitively speaking the fusion of those two states, that will not be a possible state. The state of my sitting and my standing is not a possible state. So you may want to say, look, there shouldn't be a least upper bound or fusion of these two states in this case, because you're violating the condition that every state should be possible. So initially, when in my earlier work, insisted upon bounded completeness, I was thinking all the states should be possible. I was still in the grip of the possible world semantics in that regard. And then I realized, oh, look, there's actually a lot to be gained by allowing impossible states. Okay, something is actually lost by not allowing them. So I said, let's have completeness. But the requirement that all states be possible isn't the only reason why you might want to insist upon bounded completeness. So you might want to allow that impossible states can be truth makers, but that you might think there are other reasons why a state could not be a truth maker. That hasn't been ruled out. And actually, we're going to come, well, later when it comes to the semantics of quantifiers, we'll come to see that there are these other reasons. There are these other reasons. Okay. So you might think that certain conglomerates of states, if you like, are just not suitable. They're not the kind of thing that can be truth makers, not because they're impossible, but for some other reason. Okay. So I just want you to bear in mind that we might just want to have bounded completeness rather than completeness. Okay. So so that's the pre-semantic setup. And now what we want to do is to tie state spaces, a state space. We have a state space. These are states ordered by part whole. And we want to connect them to the language. Okay. So how do we do that? We do that through a model. Okay. So the model, a state space model, will include the state space. So we'll have the set S of states. We'll have the relation of part whole. And we also need a valuation. The valuation is connecting the states to the language. Okay. Now, another distinctive feature, at least of some versions of Truthmaker semantics, not of all versions, is that it's bilateral. That is, we separately, independently specify the truth makers and the falsity makers. Now, go back to possible world semantics. When we do a possible world semantics for language, let's suppose we're just doing it for the propositional calculus. For each sentence letter, we'll say in which possible worlds it's true. We won't specify in which possible worlds it's false, at least if we're doing a classical semantics, because it's just taken for granted that it will be that the sentence will be false in any possible world in which it's not true. Okay. The possible worlds are meant to settle the truth value of every sentence, and if we think, at least if its truth value can be settled, and if we think that every sentence has a truth value, then if a possible world doesn't make a sentence true, it's going to make it false. So there's no need to specify independently when a sentence is made false. We can simply understand falsity in the possible world as its failure to be true in that possible world. Now, when we have partial states, it's not clear. Well, certainly we can no longer make that identification. If I've got the state of my sitting, this doesn't make it true that it's cold outside, but it doesn't make it false either. It simply leaves it open. So once we allow partial states, we can no longer identify making a sentence false with making it true. That still leaves open the question of whether there's some way of understanding what it is for a sentence to be made false in terms of what it is for a sentence to be made true. It's still left open. We can't explain that connection in the obvious way, in the classical way, but maybe there's some other way. Okay. And there's a kind of divide within Truthmaker semantics. And some versions of the semantics, people find some other way of explaining how it might be made false in terms of how it might be made true. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. Okay, here, but that's what you might call the unilateral approach. But on the other side, the people think no, that can't be done, and you need to separately specify when the sentence is made false. Okay, it's not simply sufficient to specify when the sentence is made true. We need to specify when it's made false. So that we now have what you might call a bilateral semantics. Actually, forgetting about Truthmaker semantics, I can give a very simple example. Those of you who are familiar with Kripke's semantics of intuitionist logic, that's a case in which we can understand making false in terms of making true, because to make a sentence false is to make its negation true. And under the cryptic semantics, a state or condition makes not P true just in case any extension or state containing it fails to make P true. So we don't just say the state itself fails to make P true. We say if any state extending it or containing it as a part fails to make P true, then we can say that P is made false. So that's a case where we can deal with the unilateral semantics, and even though the conditions are partial, we can still understand what it is to be made false in terms of what it is to be made true. Okay. That's not an example from Truthmaker Semantics, but it's an example that shows you that it may be possible to explain making false in terms of making true without adopting the straightforward classical account of what that connection is. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to be dealing here with a bilateral version of Truthmaker Semantics, one in which we independently specify when a sentence is made true, when it's made false. So that means that in the initial hookup, when we're connecting the sentence letters, the primitive sentences of our language with the states, we need to specify both which states make the sentence letter true and also which states make it false. Okay, so evaluation then is a function taking each sentence letter into a pair of sets. A pair of sets of states, one set of states being intuitively the set of truth makers, and the other set of states being intuitively the set of falsity makers. And it also means that when we extend the semantics to complex formulas of a language, we have to separately state clauses for when the complex sentence is made true and when it's made false. Okay, so not just the valuation, but also extending the valuation to the complex sentence of the language, we need separate clauses. It's what's called a double recursion. Okay, we define by recursion two notions which interact with one another. Okay, so so let's give the clauses now. So we've got the model, state space model. We've stated for each, we've got the state space, and for each formula, sentence letter of language, we said which states make it true and which make it false. And now we want to say quite generally, when does a state make a formula true and when does it make it false? And I use this notation here. There's a double vertical line followed by a horizontal line. And that's for truth making. And if the horizontal line comes first before the double vertical, that's falsity making. So those are the symbols that are being used here. And the reason for not using the normal symbols is that they have some other use. So these symbols indicate that we have exact truth making or exact falsity making. So when it comes to the sentence letters, that's simply given by the valuation. I used 5 plus for the set of truth makers, 5 minus for the set of falsity makers. So S will make P true just in case S belongs to the set of truth makers. S will make P false just in case S belongs to the set of falsity makers. Now, see if I can get this in. Okay, good. When it comes to negation, we have what's sometimes called a toggle semantics. S will make not B, this is the negative sentence, not B true if S makes B false. And S will make not B false if S makes B true. So we just toggle between truth and falsity in this case. And of course, this is appropriate for classical semantics. So I should perhaps emphasize here that for the purpose of this talk, I'm assuming that we're having a more classical perspective on the logic, that is on the logical truths. Okay. So in that particular case, so not B. So for example, under this semantics, not B will have exactly the same truth makers as B, because for S to make B not be true is for estimate not be false, and for estimate not be false is for estimate be true. So not be is going to have exactly the same content in terms of truth makers as be under the semantics, under what you might call the toggle semantics for negation. We now come to conjunction. And this next clause is the most distinctive clause in Truthmaker Semantics. Someone suggested to me that if you want to know whether someone's giving a Truthmaker Semantics, see what the clause is for conjunction, for when a conjunction is made true. Now, standardly, we say that the conjunction is made true by a state if each of the conjuncts are made true by the state. But that condition is in violation of the idea that truthmakers should be exact. So if I've got a state that makes B and C true, that is an exact truthmaker for B and C, it will not in general be an exact truthmaker for B, because part of the state S will be concerned with making C true, and that may have nothing to do with making B true. So B and C is a sentence is that I'm talking and it's colon sign. I have a state that makes that conjunctive sentence true. It's not going to be in a state that is an exact truth maker for my talking, because it's going to say something about the state of the weather, which has nothing to do with my talking. So if you like, the standard clause for conjunction presupposes a monotonicity, something like a monotonicity condition. Or at least, the very least, it presupposes that truth making need not be exact, it can be inexact. Okay. So the clause that we have is the following one: a state that makes a conjunction true must be a fusion of two states, each of which make the conjuncts true. So if S will make B and C true, that is, be an exact truth maker for B and C. If there's an exact truth maker T for B, an exact truth maker U for C, and S is the fusion of those two truth makers. So the way we make a conjunction true is by fusing truth makers for the conjuncts. So if B and C were if that was the sentence I'm talking, it's cold outside, the way we get a truth maker for the conjunction is by fusing a truth maker for the I'm talking and a truth maker for it's cold outside. And it's very plausible, intuitively speaking, that this will satisfy the requirement of exactitude. That is, that the truth maker for conjunction will be exactly relevant, will be exact truth maker, given that we have truth makers for the conjuncts, because this truth maker will, as a whole, bear upon the truth of B and C, because one part bears upon the truth of B, the other part bears on the truth of C, and there's no more to the state than these two parts. Maybe I make a general observation here. Is one natural thought is this: look, I start off with a notion of truth making which need not be exact, and then I define exact truth making in terms of it. Now, I think that's a huge mistake, and it's a mistake that has actually been made. People have wanted to get at this notion of exact truth making. They thought they could do it by starting off with some notion of inexact truth making, and then seeing exact truth making as a special case of exact truth making. This is not our approach. We're not attempting to define exact truth making. Rather, we're starting off with some intuitive notion of exact truth making, and then understanding what it is through the role that it plays. That is, it will have certain distinctive features within the semantics, and that will bring out the fact that it's exact. And this clause for conjunction is one of those distinctive features. Okay. Okay. So, in fact, you can give a kind of proof that exact truth making can't be defined in terms of inexact truth making can't be defined in exact truth making. But anyway, the general philosophical point holds regardless of that. Okay. Now, there's another comment I should make about this clause, which is that it's meant to apply both when we have when we have completeness, that's every set of states has at least a bound or fusion, and also when we have bounded completeness. So when we have bounded completeness, the fusion of two states may not exist. Okay. And we can still read this clause as applying in this case, because for S then to B, suppose that T is an exact truth maker for B, and U is an exact truth maker for C, but they don't have a fusion. There's no such thing as the fusion of T and U. Then there will be no S that's a truth maker for B and C, which is the fusion of T and U in this case. We're reading the clause in that way. So we're reading in such a way that the right-hand side requires that that fusion exists. Okay. So we can read the clause to apply both to the bounded completeness state spaces and to the ones that are just fully complete. Okay. The clause for conjunction is simply that a truth maker for B and C, a falsity maker. Sorry, there's the other clause. A falsity maker for B and C is a either a falsity maker for B or a falsity maker for C. So the relevant way of making a conjunction false is to make one of the conjuncts false. We have corresponding or dual clauses for disjunction. So a state will make a disjunction true if it can be exact truth maker for disjunction. It's the exact truth maker for one of the disjuncts. And it will be an exact falsity maker for a disjunction if it's a fusion of exact falsity makers for the disjuncts. Okay. So those are the basic clauses, and there's a very slight difference from the standard clauses. Really, it's just the truth maker clause for conjunction and the falsity maker clause for disjunction. It's really the central point of difference from a monotonic semantics. Okay. Anyway, so those are the basic semantic clauses. Okay. Now, there's an issue that will come up later, because there's a different version of the semantics that you may give. I'm going to call this the non-inclusive version of the semantics. Okay, and the issue is best explained in terms of the clause for disjunction. What I've said is that a truth maker, this is the clause 6 plus. What I've said is a truth maker for B or C. Somebody's truth maker. I have an if here, but this is these actually, I guess they're actually not. It's not a recur. Actually, I'm not giving the recursion. I'm giving the inductive definition, but it doesn't matter. The if can be turned into an if and only if. This clause says that S is going to be a truth maker for B or C, just in case it's a truth maker for B or a truth maker for C. Now, the question is this: do we say that a truth maker for B and C is also a truth maker for B or C? That's the issue. If I, instead of saying or, I said or dash and, then clearly I should include the case when S is a truth maker for B and C as a truth maker for S being a truth maker for B or C. Okay. So if we insist upon this, that the truth maker for the conjunction of the disjuncts is also a truth maker for the disjunction, then we have what's called an inclusive semantics. It's very important to distinguish this issue from the issue of whether we have an inclusive understanding of all. So, sometimes people ask, is all being used in an exclusive sense or an inclusive sense? So an inclusive sense is one that allows a disjunction to be true when both disjuncts are true. The exclusive sense is one that forbids that. When you say B or C in the exclusive sense, you're saying B or C, but not both. That is a separate issue. That is a separate issue. Even if we allowed, even granted that B or C is true when both are true, there's a separate question as to what in that case makes B or C true. On the non-inclusive view, we'll say a truth maker for B will make it true, and also a truth maker for C will make it true. But we won't allow a truth maker for the conjunction to make it true. Whereas on the inclusive semantics, we will say a truth maker, but the conjunction will also make it true. So it's not the same issue. It's actually an independent issue. Even if we grant an inclusive center, or there's still the question as to what it is that's making a disjunction true when both disjuncts are true. And it could just be either something that makes each disjuncture, or it could be something that makes the conjunction true. So the terminology of inclusive and non-inclusive, well, the reason I've used non-inclusive rather than exclusive is just to attach the issues. It's a different separate issue. Okay. All right. Turns out, since I raised the issue, why don't I raise it now? I agonized over whether to have an inclusive or non-inclusive semantics. And I think for certain purposes, one wants an inclusive semantics. For certain purposes, you want a non-inclusive semantics. I've actually become more open to having a non-inclusive semantics. But one very particular issue that arises is whether we have the principle that A and A has the very same truth makers as A. A and A, does that have the very same truth makers as A? Now, suppose we've got some truth makers for A. Any fusion of two of those truth makers, assuming they exist, will be a truth maker for A and A. Because remember, the truth makers for A and B generally are attained by fusing truth makers for A and truth makers for B. So if I've got two truth makers for A, let's call them S and T, then the S fused with T will be a truth maker for A and A. But it may not be a truth maker for A. So under a non-inclusive semantics, A and A may have more truth makers than A. And you might think, oh my goodness, how could we possibly reject that A and A have the same A and A has the same content as A? Okay. So if you have this kind of abhorrence for rejecting that principle, then you want to go for the inclusive semantics. Okay. But I think that the inclusive semantics in certain applications, especially in natural language, has problems of its own as well. I won't go into them, but anyway, there are reasons also for wanting to adopt a non-inclusive semantics. Okay. So anyway, let's just say that there are these two approaches. You might favor one or favor the other, depending upon your particular interests. Now, under the inclusive semantics, what we want to insist is that all the truth makers should be closed under non-trivial fusions. That is, if we've got some truth makers and we've got some non-empty subset of the truth makers, their fusion should also be a truth maker. We might restrict this just to non-empty finite fusions, but anyway, let's just go the whole way and say, look, what we want to do is to insist that quite generally, that it's not just a question of disjunction, we might insist quite generally that if certain truth makers, we have certain truth makers for a sentence, and I'm excluding the empty set of truth makers here, then the fusion of them should also be a truth maker. If you put truth makers together in this way, then they should also be a truth maker. It's not unlike, some of the literature in cause, the soldiers shoot the poor prisoner, so they each fire the gun, and let's suppose the bullets hit the prisoner's heart at exactly the same time. So you might think, well, each soldier caused the prisoner to die. You might think that, and you might think, well, suppose there are two soldiers. You might think, well, the two soldiers caused the prisoner to die. So even if you think each soldier caused the prisoner, I mean, the firing of when I say each soldier, I mean his firing the bullet. even if you think each soldier caused the prisoner to die, then you might be thinking there's a separate question as whether the two soldiers together caused the prisoner to die. And this is a similar issue, even if when you've got a disjunction with two true disjuncts, even if you think that what makes each disjunct true makes the disjunction true, there's a separate question as to whether the fusion of those two truth makers makes the disjunction true. It's a similar issue to the one that arises in the case of cause. Okay, and cause is both. We're talking about a kind of making in both cases. It's not the same kind of semantical making and causal making, but it's a structurally similar issue. Now, if we insist that the truth makers for the sentence letters be closed under non-empty fusions, then we can adopt under the inclusive semantics. We can adopt the standard clauses. But what we need to do is in the clause for disjunction, we need to add an extra clause and say that a truth maker for B or C is either a truth maker for B or a truth maker for C or a truth maker for the conjunction. That is a fusion of the truth makers, respective truth makers for B and C. And similarly, when it comes to the falsity clause for conjunction. Assuming you want to keep the duality here between this disjunction and conjunction. Okay. So what I've given you here are the truth maker and falsity maker clauses for the complex truth functional formulas under both the non-inclusive semantics and under the inclusive semantics. I don't know if there are any questions here at this point people might want to raise. Okay, let's continue then. Now, once we have, what we have is these clauses, okay? And now there are various logical notions that can be explained. So, if we just take standard semantics, we have, let's just take a look at the possible world semantics. Then I can explain that two formulas are logically equivalent, just in case in any model, in any world of that model. If one of the formulas is true of that world, then the other is. Okay, and I can explain logical consequence and so on and so forth. So there are a whole bunch of notions. Now, it turns out in Truthmaker Semantics, there are many other notions that you can define. And that's because there are different truthmaker relations you can define in terms of exact truth making. This is not something I'm going to discuss. I can discuss it later if you want. But there is one logical notion that will be important, and that is the notion of exact equivalence. So what I really should say is exact logical equivalence. So we have a notion of a state space model. A formula will have exact truth makers in any such model. We can say that formulas A and B are exact equivalents or exactly logically equivalent. That is exactly equivalent as a matter of logic. That is quite independently of the model, just in case they always have the same truth makers. So if regardless of what model you're in, A and B have the same exact truth makers, then we can say they're exactly equivalent. So this is really tells us when we can distinguish between the semantic content of two formulas within this semantic framework. Okay. To the extent that A and B are exactly equivalent, we are not able to distinguish them semantically within this framework. Okay. I noticed I've given here the logic of exact equivalence. I've just written it down. I actually missed something out, which is associativity. We have, so let me just go through these. So these are the exact equivalents that we have in the logic. We have that A and B is equivalent to B and A or B is equivalent to B or A. This should be evident from the clauses that they have the same exact truth makers. We have A or A equivalent to A, but we don't, under the exact under the non-inclusive semantics, have A and A equivalent to A. There is a version of the semantics in which we don't have A or A equivalent to A. I'm not going to go into that, but I actually think it's actually a helpful version actually of the semantics. But anyway, this is a point of difference between the inclusive and the non-inclusive semantics. We have the distribution principle, the following distribution: that A and B or C has the same exact truth makers as A and B or A and C. We have the usual, both De Morgan's law. We have not A and B equivalent to not A or not B, and not A or B equivalent to not A and not B. If we've got two formulas that are equivalent, that is the same exact truth makers, then in any positive context, one not governed by negation, we can substitute one for the other. You might think, why don't I have general substitution of equivalence? Well, the reason is that two formulas can have the same exact truth makers without having the same exact falsity makers. Okay, and in fact, if you look at that formula under distribution A and B or C, A and B or A and C, and they can have they'll have the same truth makers, exact truth makers, but they will not, in general, have the same exact falsity makers. This actually means we have a more restricted version of equivalence, substitution equivalence. If we insisted that there's a notion of being exactly equivalent, having the same truth makers, there is also the notion of fully exactly equivalent, which is having the same truth makers and the same falsity makers. And I guess that is, properly speaking, the notion of content we should be interested in. I thought I'd mention some open problems. Okay, so if you take standard classical semantics for propositional logic, from the algebraic point of view, this corresponds to having Boolean algebras. So there are algebraic conditions corresponding to the logical principles. Then we have something called the Stone representation theorem. It says any Boolean algebra can be represented as an algebra of sets. Where the union of two sets is understood in the usual set theoretic way, and similarly for the other notions. So it's nice to be able to establish a representation theorem for the algebras that correspond to this logic. So we write down some algebraic identities correspond to the logic that we have. And then we want to prove a representation theorem, where the representation is given basically by the state space semantics. Okay. This seems to be quite a hard problem. I've had to go at it and not had any success. Other people have tried and not had any success. So this seems to be a kind of quite difficult problem, which is surprising. You might think it will just be straightforward. But anyway, this is an open problem. The stating part isn't hard. We can easily state what the algebra should be, but the establishing a representation theorem doesn't seem to be so easy. I think so, anyway. All right. So what I want to go on to now is extending the semantics to the quantifier. As initially, I was going to talk about applications, and I'm happy to do that in the discussion, but this is something that I've currently been thinking about, and it turns out to be more problematic than I originally thought. So, and it also raises issues of quite general interest. Maybe one shouldn't feel too bad about this. If you take the possible world semantics for propositional logic, that's relatively straightforward. Now go to quantificational logic. You now face all kinds of choices. So even for possible world semantics, quantifiers give rise to a whole range of problems. Okay, even though for classical semantics, purely extensional semantics, there are no particular problems. It's just more or less evident how the semantics should go. So maybe we shouldn't be so bothered by the fact that there are these problems. Okay, so when it comes to there are two kinds of semantics we might have in mind. One is when we have a constant domain. That is, we're thinking that we have a fixed or rigid body of objects that in some sense cannot change. So the only objects that can be relevant to the truth of a quantified statement are those objects, that particular fixed set of objects. I mean, suppose, for example, we're doing a Truthmaker Semantics for arithmetical sentences, and we think, look, we don't believe in non-standard numbers, and they just are these numbers. So these, when I say for all numbers, all I can mean is I'm just talking about numbers 0, 1, 2, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I can't be talking about anything else. Okay. All right, so that's quantifiers under a constant domain semantics. And a very natural thought is this, that before I go on to say this, I should say that I haven't really gone into technical details here, but once we go to quantifiers, we have predicates of arbitrary adicity, and we're given a domain. So a model now has a domain of individuals, a fixed domain of individuals. So it's equipped with that thing. Also, instead of now, we have to, the valuation must tell us what the semantic content of a predicate is, not just a sentence letter. And it does this in an obvious way. If we've got let's say, a two-place predicate and two individuals, we have to say what are the truth makers for the predicate being true, the sentence that the predicate holds of these two individuals, and what are the falsity makers. Okay. So instead of just assigning truth makers and falsity makers to a sentence letter, we assign truth makers and falsity makers to a predicate along with an appropriate number of individuals. Okay. So I'm just taking that for granted. Yeah. And I've actually supposed that I'm just supposing for simplicity that every individual has a name. So we don't need to worry about assignments of individuals to variables or anything like that. Okay. So it just makes life a lot easier to do things that way. Then the obvious thought is this. Look, if I've got a universal sentence, I have a name for every individual in the domain. Call these names I1, I2, I3. These are the names for all the individuals in the domain. Then I've got the universal sentence for all x, a of x. I treat for all x, ax simply as a big conjunction. A of I1, A of I, and A of I2, and A of I3. So I give it the same semantics that I would give for that big conjunction. And then this will give us the following semantic clause. For some reason, I can't see the whole thing because I don't know if I can move this thing. Never mind. I hope you can see the whole thing. What it says is, look, when does a state make a universal formula for all x, ax true? Well, what we want to do is to map each individual into a state. So each individual I into a state S of I. And what we want is for S of I to make A of I true, and for S to be the fusion of all the S of I's. That's just the technical formulation of what I just said. We have for each instance, that's A of I, for all x, A of x, we have a truth maker. We pick a truth maker. And then we let S then should be the fusion of those truth makers. And I didn't give the clause, but it's a corresponding clause for S making the universal sentence false. So this is just the obvious thing to do. This is the obvious thing to do. Now, turns out we have some sort of failures of exact. We have a notion of exact equivalence, just as before, and it turns out that under the non-inclusive semantics, A was not equivalent to A and A. Well, for corresponding reasons, even when A is a closed sentence, A is not going to be equivalent to for all XA under the non-inclusive semantics. You'll remember, often that people have as an axiom that A implies for all XA when X is not free in A. Okay. And I guess a natural thought is that A and for all XA have the same content. But under the semantics that we have given, A and for all XA will not have the same semantic content, and they'll not have the same truth makers. And this is for the following reason. Look, it's actually a little bit odd because A has certain truth makers. Okay. Now look at what are the truth makers for all XA. What we do is for each individual in the domain, we pick a truth maker for A and then form the fusion of those truth makers. Okay. So suppose I have at least two individuals in the domain, at least two. That means a fusion of any two truth makers for A will be a truth maker for all XA. Because there are at least two individuals, I and J. So for I pick one of the truth makers. So that's going to be a truth maker for A of I. Of course, A of I is just A. Because the instances are vacuous in this case. And then I choose a truth maker for J, and that could be the other one. And that can be the truth maker in all the other cases as well. So then the fusion, and so then the truth maker for all XA will just be the fusion of those truth makers for the instances, which will include, if there are two individuals, then I can get the truth maker for any two truth makers for A to be a truth maker for all XA. And if if the domain has n individuals, n doesn't have to be a natural number here, then the truth makers for all XA will be closed under the fusions of n truth makers. Okay, so if there are at least as many individuals as there are truth makers, I'll have for all XA will just be the inclusive. It will give me the inclusive content, so to speak, of A. So this is a very odd consequence of this semantics that I just gave, the non-inclusive semantics. And I also point out that I said A is not equivalent to for all XA, and that's true when A itself is of the form for all XA. So for all XA may not have the same content as for all XA. And similarly for any finite string. Actually, also for infinite strings as well. Okay. So this is all very odd. And to make things worse is that we will not have in general that let me see if I can. Okay. Let's look at this thing below. We've got A, which I can take to be closed here, and for all XB, and for all X in brackets A and B. So I'm taking the quantifier out here. I've got A and for all XB. And I ask you now, take the quantifier out, it's for all X, A and B. Those two are not in general going to be equivalent. And one way of seeing that, I won't go through the reasoning, but one way of seeing that is for all X, A and B is going to be equivalent to for all X, A and for all X, B. Now, if A is not equivalent to for all X, A, there's no reason to think that A and for all X, B is going to be equivalent to for all X, A and for all X, B. So that principle, or that distribution principle, will fail. Now, that distribution principle is the principle we use, one of the principles we use in putting formulas into premix normal form. I don't know if you remember this stuff on premix normal form. We've got a formula of quantificational logic. There's a theorem that says it's going to be classically equivalent to a formula which all the quantifiers come at the front. So you have all the quantifiers at the front, and then you have a non-quantified formula following them. Okay, so you can move all the quantifiers to the front. That's what That's what a Phoenix normal form is when all the quantifiers are in the front, and we have a reduction to Phoenix normal form. That's every form is equivalent to one in Phoenix normal form. And you have various principles of equivalence that enable you to put a form into Phoenix normal form. And this is what a characteristic principle that you use. Okay. So it looks as if the standard proof that we can put a form into Phoenix normal form is failing for the non-inclusive semantics. This doesn't follow that we cannot put the formula into Phoenix normal form, because maybe there's some other way of putting it into Phoenix normal form. I very much doubt it. I haven't thought about this. But anyway, that's a problem. I conjecture that we do not have a Phoenix normal form theorem for the non-inclusive semantics. Another problem is this: is there a version of the non-inclusive semantics that does have reduction to Phoenix normal form? I don't see it. I haven't thought about these semantic problems very much. I myself don't see a way of doing it. There are perhaps some very artificial ways of doing it, but as far as I can see, there's no natural way. Now, how you react to this, I don't really know. You might, just as you might be horrified at the thought that A and A is not equivalent to A, but you might think, well, if you accept that A and A may not be equivalent to A, it's not so bad that these other things fail. So that's one attitude. So, but anyway, there's something of a quandary here as to what attitude you should have to this particular extension of the non-inclusive semantics to the quantifiers. Okay. Now, if we go to the inclusive semantics, remember the inclusive semantics is one in which we include non-empty fusions of truth makers as truth makers. Then we don't have these problems anymore. A, for example, will be equivalent to for all XA, because the only reason they were different is that for all XA included some fusions of truth makers. But in A, we already have those fusions of truth makers. So we no longer have the problem. We have a reduction to Phoenix normal form. So the inclusive semantics is much nicer than the non-inclusive semantics in this respect. Though I should point out that under the inclusive semantics, you need to modify the clause for the quantifier. Maybe it's worth pointing out. So the clause I had was that there should be this function that takes each individual into a truth maker of the corresponding instance. But if we have closure under fusion, then I want to be able to repeat an instance. I want to be able to say, look, I have a truth maker for this instance many times. So the clause needs to be modified so you have that effect. Okay, but that's just a wrinkle. Here's another open problem. The clause that I have here for the quantifier is second order. So if I were to translate it into standard classical language, it would be a second order formula I'll be using, because I'm quantifying over a function. I say there has to be a function. Okay, there has to be this function taking individuals into truth makers. This raises the question as to whether the notion of exact equivalence is axiomatizable. And again, I don't know the answer to that question. If it is axiomatizable, we'd like to have an axiomatization of it. So the very basic logic of exact equivalence for quantification of case with constant domain is not even properly understood. I mean, these are just fundamental issues that we should have answers to. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? Okay, let's now come to variable domains. And things are really quite tricky here. Now, an obvious idea in doing so this is a case when we think there could be different individuals than there are. So imagine that a domain just consists of men or people. Okay. So there are the people there actually are. But there could have been different people. So maybe there's not going to be a nuclear holocaust. So there are going to be a lot of people in the future. But maybe is going to be a nuclear holocaust in which those people in the future will no longer exist. So the domain of people or men could have been different. So if I look at the sentence like all men are mortal, the relevant, depending on which men there are, the instances could be different. So in the actual, if the men that there actually are there, if we're talking about the men in the actual world, then each of us and all the people in the future being mortal, whatever, that could be a truth maker for all men are mortal. But into this different scenario in which there are different men, it would be different men or people being mortal that wouldn't be a truth maker. Okay, so what we want to allow is that there could be different truth makers for all men or all people are mortal, depending on which people there are. Okay. We want the truth makers to be able to vary with a possible variation in the domain. Okay. Well, one way to deal with this is to introduce what I might call totality facts. That is, for each set of individuals, we take there to be a fact to the effect that these are exactly the individuals that there are. Okay. And then what we do then is take a truth maker, exact truth maker, for all x, ax, be a fusion of a totality fact saying these are all the individuals, these are exactly the individuals there are, and all relevant instances. Okay, so the instantial fact, that conjunction, the fusion of facts, of states that verify the instances, is made to depend on what the totality fact is. So I've given the clause here. So, I mean, this all needs to be worked out because in the state space, you need these totality facts and that sort of thing. So anyways, the details need to be worked out, but this is the essential idea. So state will be a truth maker for all x, a of x. There's this overall state D, which all of the individuals that we might possibly be talking about. Okay. And now we take some subdomain E. So these are the individuals that we take ourselves to be talking about. So there has to be S to be a truth maker for all x, a of x. There has to be some subdomain E of a superdomain. And some function taking each individual I of E into a state. And we want each SI to be a truth maker for the instance. And we want S to be the fusion of all those truth makers for the instances. This is the instantial truth maker, plus the totality fact. So we have the totality. So the S now is a fusion of a totality fact telling us what individuals there are, and a fusion and an appropriate instantial truth maker, which is the fusion of truth makers for all the relevant instances, the instances where the individuals are coming from E. So that is the obvious clause to have. One thing that occurred to me is that this, whatever you think of it within the context of Truthmaker Semantics, has relevance to an algebraic semantics for modal logic. So some of you may know this book by Raziowa and Sikorski called Meta-Mathematics and Mathematics, in which they give algebraic semantics for modal logic. So they, this was Tarski's idea that you have a Boolean algebra that's equipped with additional operators corresponding to the modal operators, and they try to extend that semantics to the quantificational case, and they have a problem with the variable domain. They don't know how to do it with the variable domain. Well, actually, what you need to add to the algebra are elements. It's going to be these are going to be elements of the algebra correspond to these totality facts. So actually, this device here can be used to solve the problem that they had with extending the algebraic semantics to quantificational language, where we're allowing for a variable domain. Okay, they have no problem with the constant domain because then they treat the quantifier just as a big conjunction. Okay. All right. So it has some. So this semantics has some nice features, but it gives rise to some curious problems. Okay. And this is what has recently been puzzling me. And so I devised a different version of the semantics to overcome these puzzles. Okay, so this is something I've recently been thinking about. So here's a puzzle. Okay, so suppose we have two domains, subdomains E and F. So E consists of two individuals, I1 and I2, and F consists of two distinct individuals. Okay. Then so here I've written it down here. Now look at not for all xfx, but for all xfx and for all xfx. So one truth maker for all xfx says that the domain is E, consists of these two individuals, and we have S1 and S2 as well. So it's the totality fact for E along with S1 and S2, which are truth makers for F being I1 being F and I2 being F. So that's one truth maker. Another truth maker for all xfx says that the individuals are I3 and I4. Okay. And we have now truth makers for F of I3 and F of I4. Okay. So we can now, the truth maker for the conjunction will be a fusion of these two. So what the truth maker will say is, I1 and I2 are exactly the individuals there are. I3 and I4 are also exactly the individuals there are. And I1 has F, I2 has F. I mean, when I say that, I mean we have a truth maker for that. I3 has F and I4 has F. What kind of truth maker is that for for all xfx and for all xfx? It's a weird truth maker. We're saying the totality fact. We're saying the domain is E, and the domain is also F. So it's an impossible state. And each of these individuals in E and F are also to be, we also have truth makers for each of these individuals being F. Okay. Now, I'm not trying to say that shouldn't be regarded as a truth maker, because it is a fusion of two things that could be regarded as truth maker, but it's quite weird. It makes one think something's going wrong. And under the inclusive semantics, that odd thing will be a truth maker for all x a of x itself. Forget about the conjunction of all xfx and for all xfx. It will be a truth maker for all xfx. Okay. So this is a problem, and what I'm going to suggest is a solution to the problem. And I'm sort of running out of time, so the solution really rests upon a technicality and a philosophical thought. The philosophical thought is this: that the totality fact isn't just another fact that may be part of a truth maker. It's not just another fact. It's also telling you what the other truth makers should look like. In other words, if I have a totality fact within a truth maker, that's telling me that the other truth makers should concern the individuals in question. Okay. So in particular, if I've got two distinct totality facts, if I say, these are the individuals that there are, and these other individuals are the individuals that there are, if I take the fusion of them, that's not a candidate truth maker, because the totality fact is no longer within that any such truth maker, or even if you add things to it, the totality fact is no longer playing the role within the truth maker that it should be playing. So I'm not ruling out such truth makers because they're impossible. I want to allow impossible truth makers. I want to rule it out because we can no longer think of the totality fact as playing the role within the truth maker that it should be playing. So this is actually broadening our conception of what a truth maker is. We're saying look, certain facts within a truth maker may be playing a distinctive role, and we need to, any truth maker should respect that role. Okay. So that's the philosophical thought, that certain truth makers within a truth maker may constrain what the other truth makers within that truth, what the other parts of the truth maker should look like. Okay. Not because we don't want there to be impossible truth makers, but for some other reason. Okay. What that means from a technical point is that really we should differentiate truth makers. We should think of truth makers as having two parts. One playing one role, one playing another role. Okay. We can think of them as fusions, but we still should, if you like, but we still want to differentiate the truth makers. So we want to say, look, these are playing a certain role, so I'm going to put them on one side, and these are playing a different role. So what this means from a technical point of view is we're taking a product of two state spaces. Okay. So we've got one state space, we've got another state space, and I look at the product. So in the product space, the states are ordered pairs of the states from one space and the states from the other space. Now, in this particular case, one of the state spaces will be the state space telling us what the domain is. It will be a state space of totality facts. And this state space will only be bounded complete, because I don't want in that state space for there to be fusions of distinct totality facts. Because then totality facts can no longer be playing the role we want them to play, which is telling us what the other state should be. Okay. And then we're on the other side, we have just a regular state space. This is a state space telling us how individuals are behaving. Okay. So the truth makers now, for quantified statements, will come from this product space. And now, what's going to happen when we go to this product? Let's just see how. I'm just going to talk here rather than go through the handout, because I don't really have time to go through the handout. Let's just look at that old problem that we had. Let's go back to the for all xx, fx, and for all x, fx. Okay. Under the non-inclusive semantics, we had this odd situation in which a truth maker could involve two distinct totality facts and two distinct sets of individuals. We don't want that to happen. So what happens under the new semantics? Under the new semantics, I'll have all these truth makers for all xfx. A truth maker will say, look, these are the individuals, exactly the individuals there are, and these are the truth makers for the relevant instances of for all xfx. And I'll have such a truth maker when the totality fact concerns E, the subdomain E. I'll have such a totality fact when the domain concerns F. Now, let's look at the clause for the conjunction. The clause for the conjunction says the fusion of truth makers for all xfx and for all xfx will also be a truth maker if it exists. If it exists. If the truth makers for all xfx, the two truth makers for all xfx, involve distinct totality facts, that fusion will not exist. It will not exist. So because the state space for the totality facts is bounded complete, and we don't have fusions of distinct totality facts, these fusions, when we have distinct totality facts, will not exist. Okay. So we'll just have what we'll actually have something distinct from for all xfx, but we will not have one of these weird truth makers. Similarly, under the inclusive semantics, if you look at the truth makers for all xfx, this had to be closed under non-empty fusions. But those non-empty fusions will only exist when the totality facts involved in them are the same. So again, we'll avoid having all of these weird truth makers. Okay. And I'm pretty sure, I was just thinking about this morning, and I'm pretty sure that if we have this more constrained semantics, in which these weird truth makers cannot exist, this is under the inclusive semantics, it's going to make no difference to the exact equivalence. So it's not as if when we include all of these weird truth makers, we're going to be able to discern contents which we couldn't discern before. We'll have the same exact equivalence under every model. So basically, these weird truth makers were forced upon us under the previous semantics, but they're not actually doing any semantical work. They're not allowing us to make semantic distinctions we couldn't make before. So why have them? Especially since they're so counterintuitive. Now, one thing I find interesting is that this distinction that I'm making between the role that two truth makers could be playing is already familiar both from the causal and the ground theoretic literature. Within the causal literature, people have often wanted to distinguish properly between causes and conditions. So, I strike the match, that causes it to light. Well, only if there's oxygen in the air. But striking the match causes the match to light, but you don't want to say the presence of oxygen does. That seems odd. So we naturally want to say the presence of oxygen is a background condition, whereas the striking the match is a foreground condition, and as such can be something that takes place within the background, and so can be properly regarded as a cause. And similarly, in regard to ground, people sometimes want to say, look, the grounds for a universal statement are its instances, but not the totality fact, which is some kind of background condition. Okay. Well, what happens is that within this semantics, in order to avoid certain odd results, we've had to make a similar distinction. We've had to say, look, it's helpful to distinguish between the two different roles that a truth maker may play. So this suggests that there's some kind of harmony, if you like, between what's going on within the truth maker semantics for these quantified cases and the kind of distinctions people have already wanted to make when it comes to distinguishing the role that causes or ground might properly play in the foreground from the role that might be played within the background. Okay, so I just say that as a very suggestive remark as to some connections that might exist between the present semantics for the quantifiers and as I say, distinctions within the causal and ground theoretic literature that people already wanted to make. So I think at this point I should end. Thank you very much.